It is my pleasure to introduce them to the class Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen, who is visiting us from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from the Department of General History. Professor Dekel-Chen spent the 2015 and 16 academic year as an Israel Institute visiting professor in the Department of History and the Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University. He has published extensively in leading journals and also published a number of manuscripts by major university presses. His latest publications deal with the questions of Jewish transnational advocacy and philanthropy. Dr. Dekel-Chen is currently preparing a comprehensive and illustrated history of Jewish agricultural life. I believe the tentative title is A Million Acres, When Jews Farmed the Land. It is scheduled to come out in 2018. In fact, it's part of this research that brought Dr. Dekel-Chen to Concordia and to Montreal. As you might know, the university actually provides home to a very rich collection of archival material related to Canadian Jewish history and Jewish history in general. In 2014, Dr. Dekel-Chen co-founded the Bikurim Youth Village for the Performing Arts in Eshkol, which provides world-class professional training for gifted, underserved high school students from and throughout Israel. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Dr. Dekel-Chen, who understands the format of the class. So he'll be speaking for about 50 minutes or so, and then the floor will be open to questions. But today, you will hear much less from me, because the floor belongs to our guest speaker. Jonathan, thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be in Montreal. It's my first time. Thanks very much to the professor and to the Israeli Institute for inviting me to come to enable me to speak with you, but also to conduct some of the research that I'm doing now in preparation of this next book that comes out. And my thoughts or comments today are going to be really informal. I understand that this is a class on Israeli politics and government. I am an Israeli. I don't know how many live ones you've had in your class since you began or how many more you will be having. What I'm going to try to do today is widen your minds a little bit in terms of what Israel is, place it in a way within the wider Jewish world, because it really is only one piece of a much wider Jewish world. Now, that's impossible to do in about 50 minutes. And so I'm going to try to open a window, just a window, through which we'll look and to see an example of how Israeli history and Zionist history intersects, both in the past, present, and maybe even into the future, with the rest of the Jewish world, which is very wide and very rich. Zionism, of course, we know, focuses on the land of Israel and things that you are all learning, and on the creation and the sustaining of the modern state of Israel since 1948. But there are parts of the Jewish experience that are much wider than that. All of them contribute to Zionism, but take different pathways. And so what we're going to look at today and see some pictures and hear some stories, and also, if time allows, see some movie clips, actually, from this story, which is Jewish agriculturalism, meaning Jewish farming. And for most people, it's kind of an oxymoron, right? Jews and farming, well, doesn't really work, right? And you could say Jews and fill in the next blank with lots of other things, but your first and not even your 10th guess wouldn't be farming thereafter. And that's more or less true today, but it wasn't always true. And the reason that we're going to open that window, and I think it's particularly relevant for your class today, is because, as you may or may not, I understand this is your fourth meeting, you may not have yet had time to get to, for those of you who coming into the class really weren't familiar with Zionist or Israeli history, agriculture, farming was at the core of the foundational ideology and practice of the modern state of Israel. So we know that, but what we know less about, even amongst Jewish scholars, is that farming was a core part of the Jewish experience for a great deal of the 19th century and moving into the 20th century. And whatever wound up happening in Israel, both before and after it was founded in 1948, because of or involving farming, was actually a part of a much larger picture. And that picture extended all over the world. And I'm here in Canada. I mean, I'm assuming everyone here are Canadians, right? I think that's a fair guess. Most are Canadians. Even in Canada, which may or may not surprise people, until slightly after the Second World War, there was a robust Jewish farming community. And not so much here in Quebec, but in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, fairly large and robust farming communities involving tens of thousands of Jewish farmers in farming colonies. Quite successful, actually, when compared to general Canadian farming practice. And the reason I'm here as a historian is to capture some of those images, and there's a lovely archive. Janice Rosen is not here, but the director of the archive of the Canadian Jewish community is kind enough to open up that archive to allow me to kind of plow and cull out all kinds of images from that farming life. You won't see any images here because, of course, the presentation was prepared some time ago, and I have not yet gotten my hands on those scans, but we will. For me, this idea of Jewish farming isn't just a kind of, we'll go back for one, because there was a question even before I began the presentation. Jewish farming isn't for me just a kind of idle scholarly enterprise. One thing that was not relayed to you in the introduction is that I actually I work at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It's a lovely place. But my actual life, since I've been 17, has been living on something called a kibbutz, which is a cooperative farm in Israel out, and we'll see a picture or two of it. And so for me, and I've been a farmer really since at the age of 17, 18, now very part-time, and kind of only on the weekends when I have some time to contribute. But a kind of agricultural commune cooperative of about 200 adults and another 200 children out in the middle of nowhere. So for me, there's a merging of the intellectual pursuit of trying to figure all this out and to present it to coming generations, but also the practical pursuit of living and raising children and grandchildren on a cooperative farm, in a way realizing the Zionist dream of creating a Jewish homeland in a sovereign nation and making the desert bloom. It all sounds impossible and terribly romantic. There are both romantic and very unromantic parts of it, but that's the meeting ground for me. In any case, and just to give you a physical image of what it might look like, we see here a photograph, not really Photoshop, believe it or not. It's taken from the fields of my kibbutz. Does anyone have any idea what that monstrosity is? Okay, that's a potato combine for those of you who don't know. In any case, it is, and of course this is a tractor, a John Deere tractor, and we saw actually in the previous photograph. So this is working in Israel. We'll get back to it in a moment. Someone asked me beforehand, this obviously is a much older photograph, I think it's from 1926. And in the background, you can see it's a John Deere tractor. It looks a lot different than the John Deere tractors of today. And John Deere, of course, it's a huge agricultural machinery company in the United States. And so obviously you would think, well, this must be in North America, right? Well, no, it's not. Well, this must be in the land of Israel, right? Well, no, it's not. These must be Jewish farmers. Well, yes, they are. Actually, it's a multi-generational family. So where was it taken in 1926? Does anyone have a wild guess? If it wasn't in the United States and it wasn't in Canada, there's a spoiler, and it wasn't in the land of Israel. So where on earth was this organized? You can see, sort of off to the sides, there are other implements and other tractors. So where on earth would this possibly have been taken? And it wasn't staged, it's for real. In the Soviet Union, of all places, in 1926. And we'll get back to that as an example of the universality of this farming experience and why it happened and what it accomplished. Anyway, going back to this picture, sorry for the back and forth, but as you're getting a feel, this is kind of an informal presentation. So we have a potato combine and a tractor and a few guys and a gal on the tractor, all of whom are part of the collective, the kibbutz farming collective that I work on. And they're in a big potato field, obviously, with, I'm assuming, it's kind of hard to see, some kind of grain in the foreground. It's a large, very large-scale farm, altogether about 10,000 acres. I don't know if that means anything to anyone, but it's a lot by Israeli standards, certainly. And what's in the background? Can anyone give a wild guess as to what that might be or where that might be? I'm sorry?
That's an Arab village.
It's the border with Gaza, the border with the Gaza Strip. So this gives us a clue. Oh, and that big thing over the top, if any of you have ever been to a large modern farm, that I don't really, what are those called in English? It's an irrigation system. It's like a walking irrigation system. They have them in Canada a lot, but not around Montreal. And it just irrigates because we're in the middle of the desert and there's no rain, so you have to irrigate. Anyway, as you can see, I would guess about 500 meters beyond where this tractor is farming, is collecting potatoes, is the border fence with the Gaza Strip. This was taken about a year ago, this particular photo. And what that all means is that our kibbutz is situated, as many, many others are, along the borders of Israel with its neighbors. And in this case, it's with the Gaza Strip. Now, I realize that not many of you are farmers or have farmers in your farming in your recent past and all that, but I'm assuming most of you follow the news and understand that this is a war zone for the most part. And my kibbutz's residential area, and now we'll move from there to here. Oops. And my kibbutz's residential area, these are just the dots on the map of Israel. And you can have, I would assume your professor can have an entire class about what this map looks like and how you draw maps in the Middle East and what's in and what's out of the political borders of any country. But in any case, this is a map. It's only for illustrative purposes. For those of you who really can't see that far in detail, the blue dots, all of these blue dots are kibbutzim, are distinct cooperative farming communities. And as you can see, there are a couple hundred scattered throughout Israel, and they're concentrated for the most part up around the border areas. Mine is right there. That's my kibbutz, right there. So it's sort of where the knee of Gaza turns. And that, from my house to the border of the Gaza Strip, is roughly 2 kilometers. So that machine that we just saw is in between. And a lot can be said about that. We'll just leave that hanging in the air for right now. I'm assuming that, again, most of you watch the news and understand that this whole area, without getting into any sort of judgment, is just a war zone, or it has been up and down, depending on how one measures, forever, for the last 80 years, for the last 50 years, and you can kind of decide on your own what measurement you want to take. Questions already? Wow.
Well, just back to the map.
Okay.
Because you were mentioning in the beginning, making the desert blue.
Yeah.
I can't help but notice that the Negev Desert has a less concentration of kibbutzim.
Right.
So
Sure.
it's kind of like a misnomer.
Well, yes and no, because
Because most of the lands where the kibbutzim are quite fertile, quite rich in good soil and
sure,
in water. So
they can be, yeah. But
not very deserty.
well, depends where. Depends where. The access, don't misunderstand. I mean, don't overstate. We can get into a meteorological discussion as well. And there is nowhere in Israel, anywhere, where irrigation doesn't have to be used. Nothing would grow otherwise. And they're saying that there's plenty of water. It's just not true. That there's
We have
groundwater, not really. Not for agricultural purposes. It's simply not true. And the map, what it doesn't have is a progression of years. It's simply different. They were not all developed at one time. What we're seeing, the spread that we have here goes roughly from 1919, when the first kibbutz was formed, up indeed by the Sea of Galilee, which is up there at the top. Which of course is much more fertile, but it has many other problems that would prevent sort of modern farming from occurring, and it didn't occur until the first kibbutzim came, and then running until the last ones were created, which was roughly in the mid-1970s. There were attempts thereafter, but they all failed for varieties of reasons. So down here in the Negev, for the most part, these were all and up there we see also sort of down this bottom part that would be attached here. Those all, for the most part, are from the 1950s into the 1960s. So they are, I don't know, there are one could see it in a number of ways. And the way I believe it should be seen is that there are not kibboutzim everywhere. There simply can't be. There can't be agriculture everywhere. And there are also parts of this large desert expanse that simply really can't be farmed, and more for topographical reasons than for anything else. It's mountains. It's really hard to have any kind of sustainable agriculture there. It's true, even if it's not true 100% of on 100% of the territory, 100% of the time. I have a feeling that if I start answering questions, which is fine, but it'll be more like a press conference than a kind of coherent piece. So if you can hold off, then that's what I would suggest. I promise it is now 9 o'clock. Given that hands are already going up, I will do my best to finish my part. We have to be out at 10, then we must be cleared at 10 o'clock. Okay, I will try to hold to my part of the bargain, which will be to be done sort of with this frontal piece by about 9:30, 9:35. I'll do my best, so that'll leave about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and I hope that will satisfy everyone's needs. And by the way, I'm going to be around for the next day and a half roughly, and it's very easy to find me, anyone who wants to, and we can continue a conversation or conversations thereafter. Okay, I won't run away. Okay, so we've taken that in, and from here we go to another spot on the Jewish map. Now, of course, nobody has any idea of where this is, and I only discovered this photo maybe 2 months ago. And this is in Bloomfield, Connecticut, in the United States, which means absolutely nothing to any of you, which is fine, except for me. And it was taken in 1932. And why does it mean something to me? Because it's literally right down the street from where I grew up in Connecticut. I didn't grow up in Israel. I went to Israel when I was 17. And it was right down the street. And growing up in Connecticut, I don't know if any of you have visited, it's a lovely place. There was a substantial Jewish community there. No one knew anything about the Jewish farming past. By the time I was coming of age, 1960s, 1970s, it had already been, that memory had already been erased, and there really wasn't much of a farming reality anymore. Yet, this picture, which was very representative of its time in 1932, was taken just 30 years before, so almost in the span of some of your lifetimes. Very, very little time. It's intriguing to me, and that even more so now than it was in the past, that in today's modern Jewish memory, there's almost nothing left in the collective memory of that farming past. And until World War II, so roughly 1945, 1948, somewhere between, no matter where you went on Earth, where there was a substantial Jewish community, and that was on 4 continents, between 7 to 10% of the Jewish communities were active farmers until 1948. That started to change very substantially thereafter. And we'll get into it in a little while. But the crazy thing is, and a question that I haven't, despite years of trying, haven't been able to completely answer, is why, other than this, the foundational ethos, some might say even myth, of modern Israel, that core part of Jewish farming has been erased. It's been almost entirely erased from Jewish collective memory. A couple of years ago, I went down to Philadelphia. They don't have one yet in Canada. There's a museum of recently opened in Philadelphia, the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. It's nice and shiny, and it's great. It's a great museum in terms of its modern design and all that. And there is almost nothing in it about the Jewish farming experience in the United States. And until 1948, there were about 150,000 Jewish farmers in the United States, just in the United States, without the several tens of thousands here in Canada. It almost has been erased entirely. It's just one of those questions that demands answers. Here's a map, as you heard before. I'm preparing now a book. It's going to be sort of this big, nice pictorial atlas. It's going to have a lot of maps, and some of the pictures, actually, the photographs that you're seeing here, and artwork and all sorts of other things, from Jewish farming communities all over the world in the modern period. And this is an example of one of the maps that I had. And although again, for those of you who don't recognize, it's a map of Connecticut. And as you can see, eastern Connecticut is dotted, and some of southern Connecticut, dotted with Jewish farming communities that were in existence until just after the Second World War. And strangely enough, these sorts of things come into play, at least in my lifetime, in all sorts of ways. My dad, who passed away a couple of years ago, when he first came to the United States, he was a Holocaust survivor, which is another sort of layer in all of this that we may or may not have time to talk about. He was a Holocaust survivor, came to the United States in 1947, 1948, from Europe. And he worked sort of as a part-time moonlighting job. For those of you who can see it, sort of in the middle there, in Columbia, Connecticut, as a part-time cantor during the Jewish high holidays, so Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's kind of a common moonlighting job for people who know religious liturgy and were trained in that. And before the Holocaust, he was trained as a cantor. He never got to practice because of the Holocaust, but he was a trained cantor. Anyway, we lived not far from Hartford, which is sort of in the middle. And I don't remember him going there, I was too young. But he practiced there for many, many years at this synagogue in Columbia, Connecticut, tiny little synagogue in a farming community that was replicated all over North America, to places like, I don't know, from where you guys are you all from Quebec? Because there really wasn't a lot going on, but you're from all over Canada, I would imagine. Right? Some. Okay. Do these names mean anything to you? Hirsch. These are all still small towns in Canada. Hirsch, Edinburgh. Edenbridge, Ungre, Sonnenfeld, Lipton. These are all Jewish farming communities. Most of them in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and there are many, many more. And that you would see a similar kind of map scattered all around those provinces of Canada. One of my main subjects of interest, and what I wrote my doctorate on and kind of got a lot of mileage on in the years thereafter, was Jewish farming in the former Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, for most of us in the room, is kind of ancient history. It doesn't exist anymore. It broke up before some of you were even born, I guess, in 1991. But for others of us, and those who were more interested in history, it was, of course, a big deal and transformed the shape of the world and in great part the way that we think. There is a long-term narrative about the Soviet Union that it was profoundly anti-Jewish, anti-minority in general, but profoundly anti-Jewish and anti-Zionistic. And in some respects, that is certainly true. But one of the hidden stories in the Soviet Union, and this is a map from roughly that accords to what the Soviet Union looked like before 1939. And what's in red, in the red circle I will talk about shortly. The Soviet Union launched what would become probably the most important Jewish farming enterprise in the 20th century. And barring none, maybe barring the creation of Jewish agriculture in Israel. And in this area that's outlined here, it created between 1922 and 1941, so the evening of the German invasion into the Soviet Union, approximately 200 Jewish farming colonies that comprise about 200,000 Jewish farmers. They arrived into this area that's around the Black Sea from other parts of the Soviet Union. They were brought in, they were resettled, all voluntary, none of this was forced, none of this was exile. And they started to populate, this is a much closer look at that area. They started to populate that area of the Soviet Union, which indeed was by far then, still is, the most fertile part of the country. And not only fertile in terms of its soil content and rainfall and temperature and all of that, but are there anyone here who studies Russian history or Russian literature in your spare time? Well, No. Oh, that's okay. And this area, which is the Crimean Peninsula, for those of you who are geographically challenged, this peninsula area here is kind of like the Eden of Russia. That's what they see it as. The great Russian writers idolized it or idealized it. It is considered both then and still, if you are going to be living in Eastern Europe, and certainly in Russian-speaking space, that's where you want to live. Now, all of these dots that you're seeing here, these are about 40 dots. They are all Jewish farming colonies that existed sometime, they were created sometime from 1922 and existed until 1941 with the German invasion. There are about 40, maybe 50 dots here of the 200. It's just a selection. It's just a selection, no more than that. And there were about 200,000 Jews living on these farming colonies, which were cutting edge for their time. In the same way that you may have heard, perhaps, that Israeli agriculture is amongst the best agricultural enterprises in the world by any measure. Well, strangely enough, these 200, again, you're only seeing about 40 or 50 of them, these 200 Jewish colonies in the Soviet Union for their time were cutting edge. Because there was a certain formula that, while it lasted, this universal Jewish agriculture, whether it's in the Soviet Union, North America, South America, or anywhere else, a certain formula that makes it extraordinarily good. Extraordinarily good. And then the same kind of formula, for the most part, brings it to a very quick decline. This is just an example, just again, another illustration, so we get an idea of kind of what it might have looked like. Well, this is, anyone read Russian? No. Okay, well, we have one, so we got to get out of here. It is an annual bulletin. An annual bulletin. It's actually in color, but I could only find this version of it. It's very beautiful. From 1926. An annual bulletin, and the title up top is The Jewish Farmer. This annual bulletin, as of 1927, becomes a monthly bulletin in Russian, not in Yiddish, which was the language spoken by most of the Jews in the Soviet Union, but rather in Russian, so it would have more popular consumption. And it had all sorts of things in it, but we won't get into that. It's more about the image that we see. The image that we see. Keep in mind this guy that we see on the tractor. Just looking at him in that image, what do we see? What can we learn from images? I love images. I've written a lot about how to deconstruct imagery when we see it. Like, what is this? And this is a piece of propaganda. It's Soviet propaganda. What is it trying to relay about the Jewish farmer, the reality, or at least the image of the Jewish farmer in the Soviet Union? Well, first of all, he's on a tractor. Now, for us, seeing a guy on a tractor in 2017, probably, for most of us, I guess, maybe even for me, and I'm on tractors all the time, and I take my grandsons for rides on tractors. And I think it's great, but most of us would think, well, there's a guy on a tractor who's probably a bumpkin, right, in 2017. But in 1926, to see in the Soviet Union, anyone on a tractor, it would be like science fiction. Science fiction, because there were no tractors, there was no agricultural machinery in the Soviet Union in 1926. The first 80 to 90 tractors that were brought in, they were imported because they weren't made in the Soviet Union. And the first 80 to 90 tractors, the first 4 wheat harvesters, the first deep drilling well equipment was all imported and used by these Jewish farming enterprises. So we're seeing a piece of farming, just in general, to see a tractor would be unusual. To see a Jew sitting on a tractor would be revolutionary. Because this idea of the Jew becoming a productive worker, be it through agriculture or through industry, was a revolutionary idea in Eastern Europe. And here we're going to tie in exactly to things that I'm assuming, if you haven't already touched upon them, you will in the context, or you'd better, I guess, in the context of your class, is that the foundation of Zionism in its modern form from the second half of the 19th century was built around a number of different factors. One of them, of course, was the longing, and this is the thing we usually get caught up in, the longing to go back after 2,000 years of exile since the Roman times to reestablish a Jewish a homeland in the Holy Land. Okay, we get that. But an equally important part that's often forgotten about Zionism in its European forms and other forms that it took on later was that a new Jew had to be created. The Jew of Europe, the Jew of the Muslim-speaking lands, was he or she did not deserve this new homeland that would be created somehow or another in the promised land of Israel until they reinvented themselves, until they abandoned their professions that were unworthy, that drew ridicule from their neighbors or suspicion from their neighbors, and made themselves productive. Not because they had to, because they needed to, because they would want to do that. And that would happen by one of two avenues. It would either happen through industry and vocations, learning how to be a carpenter, learning how to be a lathe operator. It could happen, although it wasn't going to happen soon, to become more educated in humanities and the social sciences. But that was much more of a distant possibility because you had to make money in the meantime. You had to actually support yourself and your family, not be a beggar, not being someone who lived off the air. So those were two avenues, but the hidden avenue in our collective memory is to go to the land, to go back to the land, to reinvent the Jewish people both individually and collectively as a reborn Israelite. Because the Israelites, in their glory during the days of Solomon and David, yes, they were warriors, that's true. But what else did they do? They were citizen farmers. They were farmers. So the Zionist ideal was, in fact, to create a new kind of Jew, not huddled over, not pale, not afraid, but standing up straight, suntanned, muscled, and completely capable of taking care of themselves and sustaining their own communities. How do you do that? You do that by producing food, farmers. So, in early Zionist ideology, this idea of the farmer soldier became the core of what the new Jew was going to look like, the new Zionist. Well, strangely enough, and I guess we can accept that. I mean, I'm, in a way, kind of living proof of that. You know, people think soldier, farmer, all that stuff. But if we know that, we also have to take into account and understand that there's a much larger picture, which is the picture of this guy who's a modern-looking Jew on a tractor in the Soviet Union, because he is an equal manifestation of that ideal of productivization, of returning to the land, and for Jews everywhere to become more productive and to be a respectable and respected part of society no matter where they live. It was a revolutionary idea that had many different places. Now, here we also see, just to go down to the ground more, the Maifeld colony, which means the month of May. May is very significant in socialist ideology, May Day and all that. And what does that look like to you? This is roughly 1936. I mean, does it look like a dump to any of you? It looks like a lovely farming colony. This is repeated about 200 times in the Soviet Union. About 400 people lived here, men, women, and children, and it existed until the autumn of 1941. And we also get a closer look, and this is just a group of vineyard workers in one of the communes called Sotzdorf. Sotzdorf, it's in Yiddish, which means the socialist village. The socialist village. This one is from Ukraine in 1941. And the Vineyard Working Brigade, so the group in Sotzdorf in 1941. This gives us another idea of the kind of propaganda that the Soviet government is also mobilizing in order to create interest and support for this very grand operation in Crimea, southern Ukraine, and elsewhere. Again, as you can see, pictures of strength. The Soviet government actually bought into all of this and really was trying to promote it. We'll keep going. Why does it end? Why does it end? Before we go here to another spot of this universal Jewish experience, why does it all end? Why so suddenly? Well, in the Soviet Union, the end is very easy to explain. How do 200,000 people on 200 very active and successful farms suddenly disappear in between the summer and the spring, the summer and the fall of 1941? I'm going to go back a little bit. How does that suddenly end? Right. Any guesses? Yeah.
Nazis, the Germans.
The German army invades, of course, the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And they roll in from 3 different fronts, but in their southern front, by August of 1941, the German army has reached the knee, that knee that you can see of the Dnieper River, and has begun exterminating any Jews that it finds. By the autumn, roughly September of 1941, they've reached Crimea. The German army has reached Crimea. By that time, there has been some evacuation, not much, some evacuation of the Jewish farmers from the area. Those that were able to escape into Crimea from southern Ukraine are able to cross over these straits into what was outside of the German zone of occupation and somehow survive the war while they are there. But as happened with all of Soviet territory, if you were a Jew and you were caught in German-occupied Soviet territory, there was a 99% chance that you were going to be exterminated. And that is exactly what happened. So 200,000 Jewish farmers became overnight a few thousand survivors, because some of them, as I said, were able to evacuate. And for a variety of reasons, those farming communities were never fully reestablished. So that's why it ends there overnight. Not because the idea wasn't good, not because they didn't have the proper support, not because the government didn't want them there, but because the German army came and exterminated along with another 2 million Jews. And the Jewish farming population of southern Ukraine and Crimea. All right, another place that is almost completely off the map, so to speak, of our collective memory about Jewish farming in this same idea of rebirth is Argentina. And in Argentina, from the late 1800s, again, until the Second World War, there is a large, robust Jewish farming community doing pretty much the same things that everybody else is doing around the Jewish world. They will top out at about 40 or 50,000. But strangely enough, is there anyone from South America here? A little bit, okay. Well, from Argentina?
No, I'm from Colombia.
Okay. Actually, there were some in Colombia as well. I recently learned, but tiny. In Argentina, there's one big difference. Much is the same. They start around the same time. They succeed for much of the same reasons. And they also decline for the same reasons that they will decline in North America, meaning the States and Canada. The big single difference is in the Argentinian Jewish community, they still remember it fondly. And in fact, one of the iconic images to this day in the Jewish community of Argentina is the Jewish cowboy. The Jewish cowboy. It does turn out that over time, what were farmers in sort of field farmers turned into cowboys, and it was all romanticized in Argentina in a number of books about that cowboy experience. So to this day, if you go to almost any Argentine Jew, no matter where they are in the world, and talk to them about the Jewish cowboys, their chest will expand in pride, and they will be absolutely sure and convince you that their grandfather or their great-grandfather was in fact a Jewish cowboy, as long as it lasted, which is very lovely and very romantic. There's only one problem: it's almost impossible, because there might have been 500 Jewish cowboys at the time. So if you do the math, in a community that has probably these days 200, 300,000 people, the possibility that their grandfather or great-grandfather was actually a Jewish cowboy is about 0. But but it's become so romanticized that that past is still very much alive, at least in the popular memory. Here is another picture. Now, had I hidden all of this, you probably would never have guessed that this was in Brazil. But yet again, we have more than ample evidence that in Brazil, also large farming communities, and here all around the same time in the 1930s. But you could transplant this photograph to almost anywhere else in the Jewish world and see similar results, all trying to do more or less the same things. Our time is short, and so one last little example, again, of the unexpected variety. The 1930s come around, and this is something that I've only recently become more aware of. The 1930s come around, and of course, I'm sure, regardless of what classes you've been attending, and you're aware that in the 1930s, life for the German Jewish community, all 400,000 of them, is becoming increasingly daunting. It's not so easy to get out for a variety of reasons. The Germans are letting them out. They simply can't go anywhere because of the migration regimes, and past is present, of course, because of migration regimes throughout the Western world. Meaning Nazi Germany will let them out under certain conditions, but there are almost no countries that will accept them, including my mother. They will not accept them in the United States or anywhere else, despite the absolute desperate danger that they're in. The German Jewish community, which is quite affluent at that time, it's probably the most affluent Jewish community anywhere in the world, and very far from the farming life. They're all white collar, very successful merchants, doctors, lawyers, what have you, politicians for that matter. They come up with an idea. They may not be able to get out. The adults may not be able to get out, but they want to try to get their children out of Germany. And one of the few ways that they can do it is by training their children as farmers, something they never would have dreamed of doing, and because they wanted their children to follow them into their medical practices or into their law practice. But it became a necessity in the late 1930s. And so the German Jewish community creates out of nothing a set of training farms in Germany that in the end would train, it's hard to get an exact number, they trained about 2,000 young German Jews, young men and women, younger than you are. They were all more or less high school age kids, in order to get a document that would attest to the fact that they were trained farmers. It was a German state document that would attest that they had undergone intensive training in farmers, and with that document, they could then immigrate to other countries. Among them to Canada, the United States, to South America, to Australia, and a very, very few made it into Palestine, in pre-state Palestine. This is one of those farms. Actually, it's called Großbriesen in Silesia, Germany. And it wound up saving, that farm alone, about 400 or 500 young German Jews who otherwise, with 100% certainty, would have been swept up into concentration camps just like the rest of their families. And one of the tragic beauties or chilling beauties of this profession that I find myself in is to be able to find stories like this and then to interview people to meet and interview people who transited through, or at this point their parents transited through these kinds of crazy journeys. But again, the reason that this could happen is because there's an awareness in the Jewish community that agriculture, in this case, in a very instrumental kind of way, but going back to the farming life can have hugely beneficial results. In this case, not just saving one from poverty and destitution, but in fact, saving, well, not one's own life, but in this case, your child's life by having them become a farmer. This is where they wound up, at least some of them, by virtue of those documents that they got, was in Hyde Farmlands, Virginia in the late 1930s. And they were brought over as a group, several dozen of them, to Virginia. Later on, were all drafted into the United States Army and were soldiers during the Second World War. Some of them continued on as farmers, some of them did not later on. Okay. I think what I'm going to do now, because I did promise that we would end with enough time for questions, I'm going to show you, just to give you that world it looks like, oh, with a small pass to my grandchildren. Hold on. And some visual images of the time. What I'm going to show you are very short clips, and I would usually do it longer, but we simply don't have the time. Some film clips from the 1930s, shot by a variety of Jewish philanthropic organizations, mostly from the United States, some from London and from Paris, who were funding these enterprises. So you can actually get a look at some of the people scattered around the globe who were engaged in this Jewish farming enterprise, all along a similar path of Zionism, although for those who were engaged in it in these other continents, there was no intent to go to the promised land of Zion. They believed that they had already reached it wherever they were, in Argentina, in the United States, in Canada, or in the Soviet Union. So this will all be very rapid, but again, it's just to give you a very quick look at some of these things. So this is in South America. It's a silent film. This was the first one, shot in, those of you who can read Spanish, it was shot by the Jewish Colonization Association. All of these are shot in order to raise funds for these operations amongst their own communities. This is all about Argentina, and this is showing us, as you can see, it's running through both in Spanish and in Yiddish, for those of you who don't recognize it. This is a Jewish agricultural cooperative, a dairy cooperative. In the largest single Jewish colony in Argentina, which was called Mosesville. That wouldn't be the way that they would have pronounced it, but it's the way that we will look at it. So, again, roughly 1923. All right, we're going to move on. This is shot in the Soviet Union in 1927. It's called Jews on the Land. And as you can see, it's in Russian. It's not in Yiddish. So it had a soundtrack. There was an orchestra. This was shown throughout the Soviet Union. The idea here as well was to kind of popularize the idea of Jewish agricultural settlement. There's a backstory here for in Russian through the subtitles, which is showing how the Jews used to live, which is what you're seeing here, as opposed to what they were going to encounter when they moved to southern Ukraine and Crimea. Where were they moving from? Well, Jews until that time in Eastern Europe were all crowded into a relatively small space called the Pale of Settlement. And this allowed them, this resettlement project, allowed them to move away from a very war-battered, impoverished area to this new kind of Garden of Eden that I was talking about before. And this publicity film was designed to encourage Soviet citizens, not Jewish, to contribute money to this new project. 1927, a woman, that by the way is a woman named Rosenblum, or so the film says, on a tractor. So if tractors were like science fiction in the Soviet Union, then Jews on tractors were, it's a crazy idea, but a woman Jew on a tractor in the Soviet Union would have appeared to the viewers as something utterly impossible, almost like magical. But that's what they're seeing here. With, for those of you who don't know, that's a threshing machine. Sorry about the quality, but it is 1926 after all. All right, we're going to keep moving just to save time, but you're getting the idea. And I think we'll go straight to the last one. We're getting into the Saudis now. This one sort of explains itself as another means to rescue Jews. Sasua, for those of you who don't know, is in the Dominican Republic. The year is 1940. The homeless people of troubled Europe in translation means Jews from Nazi Germany.
Recognized the opportunity presented to his sparsely settled country in giving welcome entry to European exiles.
European exiles, translation, Jews from Nazi Germany.
Construction begun at Sasuan of fertile, breeze-swept acres In the spring, after the signing of an agreement between the Dominican government and the Dominican Republic Settlement Association, seized on the 30th of January 1940, the fact was unique in history. Hundreds of virgin acres were cleared in the first month.
In the end, about 500 German Jews resettled in the Dominican Republic and survived the war there. The plan was to bring in about 100,000, but the German invasion of France made that impossible because transatlantic transit by civilians became difficult, if not impossible, and of course the border with Germany closed entirely. But about 500 were gotten out before.
Home, husband, and children must receive their constant care and attention. And in addition to housework, it is the women's task to help conduct the schools. The entire family must learn Spanish, for when they are Dominican citizens, it will be their tongue. With guaranteed freedom from discrimination, full rights and opportunities, the refugees can here, by their own hard work, build a useful life.
Okay, we'll go straight to the last one. This is from Palestine, so getting back to the subject of your classes from 1936. It's the first sound movie made in Palestine. Again, for the purposes of publicity and fundraising in the Jewish world.
Which God promised to Abraham.
Highly edited and incredibly controversial when we look at it now. Again, one could teach an entire course just from this film and what it means in the imagery and the soundtrack.
When the Jews were driven out, the land gradually declined. Primitive life returned. They are going to break up the great new seaport of the East. To the old Jewish city of Tel Aviv, to the new Jewish settlement, jubilantly to work.
New Jewish settlement, in this case meaning a kibbutz. These are real people that are shot here for the purposes of a publicity film. Not understanding what they're doing. These are irrigation ditches. It's a primitive form of modern
Modern
irrigation.
machinery, the Jews are bringing back to Palestine its long neglected fruitfulness. the cooperative colonies of Palestine, where a national idealism is linked with a social idealism, and the work of every man and woman is directed to a social and not a personal goal. Out of these cooperative colonies will come undoubtedly new forms of human organization, valuable to the Jewish homeland and instructive to the rest of the world.
Okay, so this is a kibbutz. It's in the Jezreel Valley, for those of you who are interested. And what you're going to hear now is an iconic song performed by actual people who live there, it turns out. An iconic song within Zionist history. It's called the Song of the Jezreel Valley. In the dining room of this kibbutz in 1936. Keep in mind, everyone that you're seeing here, these are actually members of that cooperative, that kibbutz. They're all themselves immigrants from Eastern Europe. They are a living piece of this Zionist ideology in terms of resettlement in the land of Israel, but they're also part of that parallel part of the Zionist ideology and that more universal ideology of productivization. They were all of them, first generation farmers. It turns out they became very good and proficient farmers, but their parents had not been. They were, in a way, going backwards in time, going against the grain of modernization, which in general was leading towards industrialization, urbanization. Their parents, for the most part, were teachers, were merchants, that sort of thing, and perhaps had small trades. And here they were latching onto an ideology that would not only resettle them in a different country, a different continent, but would also change their and their children's and grandchildren's professional landscape entirely. So it's part of a very often forgotten part of the Zionist but also general Jewish experience of the time. And if there's a lasting conclusion that one could have from what I've been trying to present, it's that there are many things going on during those formative decades of Zionism and the birth of Israel that are part of much larger trends in the Jewish world that will change it in some lasting ways and some not. And for those of you who are interested, I'm not so sure about what's going on in Canada, but strangely enough, I found that in the States, there are many new, and I'm talking like several years old, no more than that, new experiments in Jewish farming, sort of going back to the land, scattered all over the place. The idea being to try and rebirth what this was, but in more limited ways. There's no one, I haven't seen it anyway, creating new colonies, but certainly creating all sorts of farms that are bringing Jews back to the land. A lot of these young folks, many of them your age and slightly older, aren't even aware of this history. It's something that is kind of organically happening to them as a result of all sorts of things, amongst them, of course, a renewed concentration on food culture everywhere in the Western world. So with that, I will end. I went a few minutes over. We have about 10 minutes, quick minutes, for questions and answers if you have them. If not, I can keep talking and telling stories at this point, and if you have any questions. Or need clarifications about what, yes, we'll go back.
This is a different question than I had at the beginning of the class.
Okay.
You were talking about Jewish farming history in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I was interested, you didn't mention Gorobadjan, the Jewish autonomous oblast in Siberia.
Okay, well, good for you that you know about this. There were two major episodes during the Soviet Union of Jewish farming. One was big, which I showed you, 200,000 people, 200 colonies. It was really something, cutting edge agriculture, kind of you name it. And the other thing that was going on, which this gentleman mentioned, was that the Soviet government, for reasons of its own, go back, for reasons of its own, declared, well, in 1934, declared a Jewish national homeland in the Soviet Union. located not where we were looking, but in a place called Birobidzhan. Has anyone ever heard of Birobidzhan? Except for this gentleman. A few. Where in God's name is Birobidzhan?
Northern China.
It's on the Manchurian border. It's to this day, still on the books in the Russian Federation, Putin's Russian Federation. It is still on the books as the Jewish autonomous region of Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan is a play on words that connects the two rivers, major rivers that were in that area. And it was created as a kind of Soviet countermove to the growth and the popularization of Zionism and moving towards the homeland. Now, the big difference was that, by the way, Birobidzhan, it's not some little small entity, it's about the size of Belgium, that territory. The difference was that the Jews of the Soviet Union didn't take the bait. They didn't really go there. It was way too far away from where they lived. They recognized that it really didn't have a future as a Jewish homeland or much of anything else. At most, 16,000 Jews were there as farmers, and the entire Jewish population never went beyond 30,000, and there was huge turnover. But it's still on the books as the Jewish autonomous region. And if you go there, I mean, tourists go there once in a while. I've never had the urge to go that far. The mosquitoes are too big, and it's too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. Although after a day in Montreal, I'm not so sure anymore. Anyway, the signs on the train station are still in Yiddish as a kind of gesture to that history, but there are almost no Jews left there. And those who remain, there was a small Jewish community in Birobidzhan until the early 90s when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and they, strangely enough, and there is no real explanation for this, they moved almost en bloc to Israel in the early 1990s. So there are almost no Jews left there. Yes?
I just have a general question. I think Jamaican and Rastafaris believe in Zionism as well, like
Yeah.
in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And there was a large Jewish community in Jamaica that came from Spain
Yeah.
and Portugal in the 1400s. I was wondering if there's a general influence that Zionism throughout the world in different religious sects that have happened because of Jewish elements. Like what I'm asking is, did it influence culture in the Dominican Republic the way it did in Jamaica? Like, but they've been there a long time. Has it had like a big influence in the population?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Yes, in fact, there was a small but significant Jewish community in much of the Caribbean, and not just in Jamaica, and not just in the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic, much later arrivals. They only come in 1939, 1940. Jamaica, they've been there since the 15th century, more or less, and in Curacao and all sorts of other places. And they are part of, there are two, without getting too deep into it, there are two major sort of sects in the Jewish world, ethnically speaking. There's the European sect, which is Ashkenazi, and then there's the non-European sect, which is called Sephardic Jewry. And the Jamaican Jewish community is definitely of that sort. The Zionism in general, and certainly productivization, both within Zionism and outside of Zionism in the Jewish world, was a very late arrival to the Sephardic world. For a variety of reasons. We don't nearly have enough time to talk about it. Quite honestly, I can't really explain why. I kind of know, but not really. So if you're looking at the Jewish world in general, it would be much, much less impactful, these ideas of productivization on the Sephardic world. Because their lives were so much very different in the Ashkenazi world. Some would say better, but they're just very different. In terms of the Dominican Republic, those 500 Jews or so who made it there, they didn't stay, most of them didn't stay for very long. And by the end of World War II, many of them had been able to migrate from there to Miami, actually. And those who stayed, because there was an overabundance of men, they married into the local population. And it's fascinating. I mean, there's a really good book about this, 2 books now, about the this Dominican experiment. And they created a kind of hybrid Jewish Catholicism with local pagan inflections. It's fascinating. But there were so few of them that they didn't really have an impact across the Caribbean. Yes?
Well, I have 2 things. The first thing is about dimensionalism. Canadian farming, actually my old roommate, his sister was Jewish, and her family has like a farm somewhere in Canada. My other roommate, he was part of like a labor Zionist like summer camp, where like the emphasis was farming. I think it's very much alive. The second thing is a question. You mentioned like the importance of the Zionist ethos and with farming, but I think it's not really as important today. And I was wondering, what is the current state? Because Israel's population is urbanized. I think something like 90, something crazy, some big number of Israelis live in urban cities, where it wasn't like that in the past. And the kibbutz has kind of been on a decline since I think the 60s or 70s. Okay. So where is the current cultural?
It's we're going to run out of time, but in general, and there's certain kind of adjustments need to be made to you're stating things, but there's really a question mark. And first of all, kibbutz population, strangely enough, hasn't declined at all in absolute numbers, but percentage-wise it has in terms of the general population. The general population has gotten, of course, in Israel much larger. I mean, at the birth of Israel, there were 600,000 people living in Israel, of which, maybe 40,000 were kibbutz members. Well, there's still 40,000 kibbutz members, but now there are 7 million citizens or 6 million Jewish citizens of Israel, if I recall correctly. And actually, it's on an upswing, strangely enough. And people were, in fact, eulogizing the kibbutzim because there was a demographic decline not too long ago in the 90s, mainly because of economics and kids moving away from the farm. By the way, it's a universal truth across the Jewish world. The third generation of farming kids leaves. It just is. It doesn't, and it can be explained in all sorts of ways, don't have time. The third generation leaves. They want to be other things. They don't want to live on a farm. And sometimes even the second generation. But a startling thing has begun to happen in the last 10 years. There's a re-movement towards the kibbutzim in Israel, not as full members of our cooperatives, but rather as residents. Young people, young families want to come back. Many of them are own children who want to come back. They've grown up, they start having families, and they're coming back. Now, in terms of farming, it's true. In Israel, farming is no longer considered a kind of honorable but desirable thing to do. But that's true everywhere in the modern world. It's very hard, except for small groups of people, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever, who see it really as a kind of life mission or an interesting hobby. And so, it's very much the same in Israel, because we are, like it or not, we are a modern country, and those are the trends. So even that relatively encouraging large influx of people, very, very few of them actually want to work on the farm. They will continue to work in their own professions while bringing up their children in what is a very lovely community and very open and safe and all that. But not a lot of young people, including my own kids, want to do what we did. But again, that's a universal truth in the farms.
Jonathan, we have 2 questions at least, and only about 2 minutes left. Okay. So why don't we just hear the questions and then see if you can answer partly, either, both, none, and then at least hear the questions, and then the conversation can continue. Yes. So one in the back, and Corey. No, some camera.
I'm just wondering, how much does of Israel's food supply do they import from other countries or neighbors, and how much is coming from the kibbutz and then?
And Cameron, your question.
Yeah, I just suppose that the 200 or the kibbutz concept came indirectly or directly from the Soviet Union, the colonies that were created. Yeah. I'm wondering why they were created in the first place in the Soviet Union.
All right. Well, they didn't come from the Soviet Union. This idea of an agricultural commune way predates the creation of the Soviet Union in 1917. It goes back to the 19th century, and it's a universal concept. They were happening, agricultural communes were sprouting up everywhere in the world, including in North America and in Canada, and there are entire social movements around this. It grafted onto that is socialism, right? Political socialism. And so the creation of the kibbutz movement or movements in Israel is part of this general global phenomenon that's happening all over. And it was grasped, and this idea of collective communities for farming is both an internal decision by the young pioneers who want to do it, but also by the support agencies, because everywhere in the Jewish world, if there's a successful agricultural movement, it's successful in part because it's getting funding, in kind or actual resources from Jewish funders elsewhere in the Jewish world who want these communities, who believe that these communities must be collectivist at their beginnings in order to maximize the resources. The funders themselves are all very wealthy bankers, arch capitalists, but they understand, they're businessmen, they understand that to maximize their resources in the creation of these new settlements in the middle of nowhere, be it in Argentina or in the land of Israel or in Russia, they have to be collectivists because there is an economy of numbers, an economy of resources in collectivism. So this all comes together to create a very, very specific formula that I was really only hinting at. Going back to the question before, Israel is a self-sufficient, it's a very strange thing in the modern world. It is completely self-sufficient in terms of food, period. It is meant to be that way in terms of national security. Israel has a national security problem in all sorts of ways in terms of resource supply. And it can never allow itself to be dependent on food on anyone. For those of you who don't understand, Israel could be choked to death by boycotts, which it certainly had in the past in energy, and it can't allow itself to not be food independent because we could literally be starved to death. So part of this very large kibbutz enterprise is about making sure that we can produce our own food supply economically and with excellence. The kibbutzim provide of all of Israel's food production, I don't know the exact number, but well over half of its entire food. There are some food imports. It's a big argument now in Israel to bring down prices, like anywhere else, to selectively bring in food exports, but they're competing with local products and not replacing them or in any way supplementing them because we're completely food independent and a large exporter at that of food products. Like kibbutz, we export about 80% of everything that we produce.
All right, but unfortunately, there is always a time to end.